Welcome back. This is program number 8 in our accelerated NLP training series, and we're going to move on now to the Milton Model as we continue our series on language. Now, we've talked about the hierarchy of ideas. We've talked about presuppositions. So this is a pretty good basis for us to begin now to talk about the Milton Model. Masters of language of all time have been able to control the abstraction to the specificity of language, and I think that that's what this whole section's about, is being able to control the level of language that you're speaking or that you're working with someone. And what is that level of language? What is the level that you need to talk to them at? What level will produce the proper results for the kind of results you want to produce? So let's turn to page 40. Mind reads. Milton Model. Mind reads are the first category. And first of all, what is the Milton Model? Well, you know, Bandler and Grinder went off to study Virginia Satir originally, and we're going to talk about the meta model later on. They went originally to study Virginia Satir, and they got the idea from Virginia because she could do spectacular work just by getting more specific. Virginia would chunk down and get more specific, chunk down, chunk down. She'd really get really specific, and people's problems would disappear as if by magic. And so they wrote the book, The Structure of Magic, volumes 1 and 2. And primarily, in essence, what she was doing was simply getting more specific. Where somebody said, she hurt me, Virginia would say, how specifically? And then they went off to study Milton Erickson. And when Bandler and Grinder went off to study Milton, see, now imagine doing this and having in your mind, here's the idea that getting more specific is what to do to create great change. And now imagine having that in your mind and going off and listening to Milton Erickson. Whoa, now here's a guy who was so abstract and so hypnotic that they had to change their whole thinking. And so they came up with the Milton Model. And the Milton Model, of course, is the opposite end of a full spectrum of getting specific, which is what the meta model is about. Now, the Milton Model actually has specific hypnotic language patterns. They're the language patterns that seem to produce trance in the person when you're talking to them. Now, the reason why they produce trance is because the client, in listening to what you're saying, needs to go in and needs to produce a trans-derivational search, or a search at the unconscious level, to create new associations and have new ideas as to why or as to what the meaning of the word is that you're using. So hypnotic language patterns, a la the Milton Model, are what we would call artfully vague, or they're specifically vague, designed to produce a specific result in a specific area. By giving you, 18 or 19 different categories of language patterns, the idea here is not necessarily that you would know the names of the categories, at least not at this point. You certainly don't need to memorize the names of the language patterns until you decide to become a trainer. But as a practitioner, simply being able to use the different types of language patterns is absolutely sufficient. But I want to go over these so that you have an idea of what the names of the language patterns are and what the kinds of words are, and I want to give you some examples. Milton Model patterns are in use throughout all of society. There isn't one stratus of society that doesn't use them. And I've had a lot of people say to me, oh, Tad, I couldn't possibly use these in business. Well, give me a break. People use them in business all the time. And we have a specific section in our practitioner training, if you come and take it, where we'll show you how to use them in business. For purposes of this program, we're simply going to learn how to use hypnotic language patterns in general. And I think that's the best place to start. Milton Erickson told a story once that a long time ago, when he began to do hypnosis, he thought the best thing to do was to write out about all of the ways he knew to induce trance. And so he said he started, and he laid out all of the different methods and techniques and specific processes for how do you induce trance in a person. And he said as he began, he accumulated a number of pages. And he got 1 page, and he began to get 2 pages and 3 pages. And when he got all done, he sat down on a typewriter and typed them all out. And when he got all done, he had 30 single-spaced typewritten pages with very, very small margins. And he said this was his entire compendium of how do you induce trance. He said, but as he learned how to be more artfully vague over the years, and as he learned to utilize states of trance and hypnosis that other people hadn't been using, he said he began to cut down those 30 pages to 29 and then 25, and then 20, and then 15, and then 10, and then 9, and 8, and 7, and 6, and 5, and 3, and then 2, and then 1. And then he said he cut it down to one page, and then one paragraph, and then one sentence. And then one time he was in Mexico, and they asked him to induce trance in a woman, and she didn't know English, and he didn't know Spanish. And he induced trance in her with no words at all. So how did Erickson induce trance in people and be so artfully vague? And how did he induce trance in ways without using language specifically? Well, the Milton Model's how. So let's look at number 1 again. A mind read is claiming to know the thoughts or feelings of another person without specifying the process by which you came to know the info. I know that you're wondering how that's possible. And it's a good thing to wonder. Now, I know that you're wondering is a mind read. Number 2, lost performative. Lost performatives are value judgments which may include an unspecified comparison, where the performer of the value judgment is left out. So we could say, as I mentioned before, it's a good thing to wonder. That's a lost performative. Number 3, cause and effect, where it's implied that one thing causes another. That includes the attribution of cause outside the self, and implied causatives include cause and effect, which includes the verb to make, if-then statements, and as you, then you, and the word because. Those are all examples of cause and effect. Number 4, complex equivalence, when two things are equated as in their meanings being equivalent. And we say that means so forth and so on. We talked about that under presuppositions. Number 5 is presuppositions. They're the linguistic equivalent of assumptions. And we could say, and you're learning many things, as an example of presuppositions. Number 6, universal quantifiers. That's a set of words which has no referential index and is a universal generalization. And we could say all the things, all the things. Number 7, a modal operator. Those are words which imply possibility or necessity, which form the rules in our life that you can learn, as an example. Modal operator is that you can learn. Modal operator includes words like should, shouldn't, must, have to, can, it's possible. Number 8, nominalizations. And a nominalization is a process word which includes verbs which have been frozen in time by making them into nouns. And we could here use an example of provide you with new insights and new understandings. Number 9, unspecified verbs. An unspecified verb or an adverb modifier doesn't specify the verb, so we say and you can. We wouldn't say how. We wouldn't say how you can have new insights. We wouldn't say that you can have new understandings or how you'd have new understandings. It says and you can. Number 10, tag questions. A question added after a statement designed to displace resistance. Now, tag questions are useful, aren't they? And in selling, they're called tie-downs, aren't they? I've used tag questions for a while, haven't I? You may have heard me use tag questions before, and I probably will continue to use them, won't I? Okay, number 11, next page, page 41, lack of referential index. A phrase which has lack of referential index does not pick out a specific portion of the listener's experience. So we'd say one can, you know. Comparative deletion, which is an unspecified comparison where a comparison's made and it's not specified as to what or whom it was made. Words like more or less, best, worst, least. Those are all comparative deletions. Also, unspecified deletions include things like clearly and obviously. Clearly, it's the best way to go. And the example here is it's more or less the right thing. Number 13, we're pacing the client's current experience, where the client's verifiable external experience is described in a way which is undeniable. So, for example, you're sitting here, where you are, and you're listening to me. Of course, in this book, in page 41, it says you're looking at me, and if you are, good job. You're hallucinating nicely. Number 14, double bind, and that's where the client is given two choices, both of which are preferable or desired, usually separated by an or. Here is a conscious, unconscious double bind. We drop in a phonological ambiguity first, just for fun. And we say, and that means that your unconscious mind is also here and can hear what I say. And since that's the case, you're probably learning about this and already know more at an unconscious level than you think you do. So it's not right for me to tell you learn this or learn that. Learn it any way you want, in any order. That's a conscious-unconscious double bind. Number 15, conversational postulate. The communication has the form of a question to which the response is either yes or no. If I want you to do something, the question is what else must be present so that you'll do it, and you'll do it outside of your awareness, which allows you to choose to respond or not, and you can avoid authoritarianness. For example, if your child, you had a kid and you said, hey, shut the door. If it was a teenager, or can you say, hey, shut the door, and the kid would go, could have react to that. But you could say, can you shut the door? Can you shut the door? And if you have a teenager, the teenager will say yes and walk through the door and leave it open. Number 16, extended quotes. This is where quotes are extended beyond what is normally used, and that displaces resistance. And the extended quotes might be like, for example, last week I was with Richard, who told me about his training in 1983 at Denver when he talked to someone who said, and then you go on and on like that, right? Number 17, selectional restriction violation. A selectional restriction violation is a sentence that's not well formed. For example, a chair can have feelings, or remember that the walls have ears. And one of my favorites is, that pen you've been taking notes with all along, how much more does it know than you know? Okay, number 18 are ambiguities. We put a whole bunch of ambiguities here under number 18. Phonological ambiguity, where two words with different meanings sound the same, as in here and here. Here. Yeah, right here, what I'm saying. Syntactic ambiguities, where the function or the syntax of a word cannot be immediately determined from the immediate context, such as they are visiting relatives, or selling salesmen can be tricky, or I'm really over managing managers. Ooh. Listen to that one again. I'm really over managing managers. A lot of syntactic ambiguity in those questions, or in those statements. Number C, the scope ambiguity, where it cannot be determined by linguistic context how much is applied to that sentence by some other portion of the sentence. For example, speaking to you as a child. Who's speaking to you as a child? Am I speaking to you as a child, or am I as a child speaking to you? The old men and women. Now, are the women old or not? We don't know. The disturbing noises and thoughts. Are the thoughts disturbing or not? We don't know that either. And the weight of your hands and feet. Is it the weight of the hands, or is it the weight of the feet also? And then punctuation ambiguity, where either punctuation is eliminated, as in a run-on sentence, or that pauses occur in the wrong place. For example, I want you to notice your hand me the glass is an example of a run-on sentence. You can also not finish sentences, which is a real ambiguous punctuation. And a lot of times people don't finish. Actually, I don't know if you know someone who can go on and not quite finish a certain thought because they have other thoughts that come on too quickly. And then sometimes they just run on and they say, well, I got to tell you about, but first let me tell you. And then and they go on and on like that. And they don't ever finish a certain, if you remember, I don't know if the old radio shows with Gracie Allen is a fine example of punctuation ambiguity where the person doesn't finish the sentence. Or punctuation ambiguity occurs where the pause occurs in the wrong place and the person goes on into the next sentence and then stops in the wrong place every time, and they use punctuation ambiguity on a regular basis and stop the sentence seemingly in the wrong place. But there's a radio announcer in the United States, if you're from the US, who I'm sure you've listened to, and you may have heard him say, "This is Paul Harvey. Good day." And he uses that punctuation ambiguity as his entire gig. It's made him very popular for years and years and years. Okay, finally, utilization. Remembering to utilize everything that happens or everything that's said. Client says, I'm not in a trance yet. You could say, that's right. You're not in a trance because you're evaluating this with your conscious mind. And trance is gone into by the unconscious mind. Or a client could say, I'm not sold. And you could say, that's right, you're not sold. Because you haven't asked me the one question that will have you be totally and completely sold. Now, the thing about the Milton Model is it's something that happens at the unconscious level. The Milton Model is not something that you can do consciously. The Milton Model is something that you have to be unconscious about. I'm not suggesting you're unconscious about it. What I'm suggesting is your unconscious is the part of you that has to do something about it. Now, you may wonder, and I suppose that you could wonder as much as you wanted to wonder. And you could wander from idea to idea, wondering about how many ideas you could come up with. Because that means that you're beginning to think at the unconscious level. And of course, you've thought at the unconscious level all along. You haven't thought consciously necessarily about all those things, nor have you thought necessarily unconsciously about all those things. But all the times that you think that you can learn certain things, your unconscious probably has already learned them, and your unconscious may have learned them before you learned them consciously, providing you with new insights, new things that you've learned, new understandings. And you have, haven't you? You have in the past, I'm sure. And one can learn certain things without thinking much about it. Because many times we've learned more or less differently, and each time we've learned the difference between knowing exactly the right word to use at the unconscious level. Now, you're listening to me, you're listening to the sound of my voice. You probably have the earphones on very, well, either loosely or not, on the top of your head, over your ears, and you're listening carefully, or you may have me on speaker so that you can actually hear what I'm saying clearly. It's not just your conscious mind that's listening, because your unconscious mind can hear what I say, and can hear, listening to everything I said. Milton Erickson used to say that the client, when he comes into the room, brings with him both his conscious mind and your unconscious mind. And he said, I always know that when I'm talking to a client consciously, I'm also talking to a client's unconscious mind. And you can learn those things at the unconscious level without even having to think consciously about them. And you may know already more than you think about language, because your unconscious mind has heard this all along. You've heard language your whole life. Now we're simply giving it some form or some structure. Giving it some structure that will allow you to do this easily and effortlessly. Be able to utilize this in many ways that you hadn't even thought possible. Perhaps you hadn't even thought of. The feeling of your feet beneath the floor. Feeling those things that you need to feel to know you understand what you're doing. Because in the past, Dr. Erickson said, a chair can have feelings. And how do you like that? So that's just a little example of how one might use the Milton Model to chat, to have a little talk with someone. Now, the Milton Model is fun, and here's how I think that it would be best if you had the time to do this. Early on, I did two things. One of the things I did was I took the Milton Model pages and I copied them. So that would be what pages would that be? 40, page 40, 41, and 42. Take those 3 pages and make a copy of them and put them in your pocket. Fold them up and carry them with you for a while. That's what I did. I carried them with me, and if I was riding on a train or sitting at a stoplight or waiting for an appointment, I would take them out and I'd read them. And I'd read them over and over and over again. I will tell you that there's no substitution. There's no substitute for being able to take and really spend the time you need to spend with these language patterns. Every moment you spend with the language patterns will surely be repaid in terms of your ability to use language in ways which are different, in ways which are exciting, in ways which cause people to be able to make changes at the unconscious level. Use your Milton Model patterns. Learn them, and what we'll do in class is we'll share some of our Milton Model patterns. So here's what I would do. I would start a notebook if I were you. And it only needs to be 30 or 20 pages, actually. Take a notebook, and at the top of each page of the notebook, put a different language pattern. So at the top of page 1, put mind reads. And the top of page 2, put lost performatives. And the top of page 3, put cause and effect. And begin to make for yourself a little diary, a little list of language patterns. Because one day you'll be talking along, and one day something will come out of your mouth, and it won't be something you've heard, and it won't be something you've thought of necessarily, but it'll be something that is absolutely magnificent from the point of view of a language pattern. And if you write it down, that means you'll be able to use it again. And you'll be able to capture it and use it again when you need it in sometime in the future. Language is an incredibly rich way of being able to communicate, and I just love it. And when we see you at the training, we'll hope to share more of that with you. And so you'll be able to really, really experience the fun that exists with the Milton Model. Okay, let's move on to metaphors. Metaphors are fun. Metaphors are simply about stories, aren't they? They're simply telling stories. And I think metaphors are telling stories. And they're telling. If you're into metaphors, I think they're about telling stories. So, metaphor design is on page 43. And we're also going to be referring to the slides on page 8 of the slides at the same time. So maybe you could fold down page 8 in the back of your notebook, because we'll be accessing some of the pages from there. Okay, so let's talk about metaphors. The purpose of a metaphor, the main purpose of metaphor, is to pace and lead a client's behavior through a story. The major points of construction of a metaphor consist of displacing the referential index from the client to a character in the story, pacing the client's problem by establishing behaviors and events between the characters in the story that are similar to those in the client's situation, accessing resources for the client within the context of the story, and finishing the story such that a sequence of events occurs in which the characters in the story resolve the conflict and achieve the desired outcome. Now, that entire process is very, very simple to do. Actually, that was the big picture. We're going to get more detailed in just a moment. But let me tell you a couple of stories. When we used to do business consulting, we would talk to our clients and talk to them in a certain way. And we always tried to future pace our clients through a metaphor or two that allowed them to make choices about whether or not they wanted to use us for business consulting. And one of the stories I used to tell, and I think it's probably a pretty good story even today, was I used to talk about the 4 prerequisites for success in the new millennium. And I wouldn't talk about it as though I had done it. So I usually used to talk about it as though it was a business consulting friend of mine who said this, which made it more dissociated. And so I would say there's 4 things necessary for business success, I think. And this is what my business consulting friend told me. The first thing he said was, if you really want to get somewhere, you need to have a business plan. You need to have a plan of action, an idea of where it is that you're going. The second thing for success that you need to have is if you need to have some sort of feedback mechanism. You need to have regular financial statements so you know if you're on track with your plan. If you know you're moving forward with your plan, if you know you're moving forward sufficiently with your plan, you need to have some sort of feedback, some sort of idea of where it is that you're going so that you can test of whether or not you're getting there. And then the third thing, he said, is if you're not producing the kind of results you need to produce, you need to be willing to change now. And then we'd actually let the client, we'd talk to the client for a while after that. And we finish it up with the fourth prerequisite for business success is, if you don't know what to do, then find someone who can assist you. Find someone who can really help you to be able to do that. As we told that story, it really made a major difference in our ability to produce results with our clients, especially in the enrollment segment of what we were doing. You know, major storytellers, major bards and poets have been revered throughout all time. I remember one time actually my son had just been born, and I was at just after he came home from the hospital, and I was at home, and we got a call. And this fella called me on the phone and he said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so from Grolier Encyclopedia." Now, Grolier Encyclopedia at that time was a rather big encyclopedia company. And I said to him, "No, I don't want to buy an encyclopedia." He said, No, I just want to come and talk to you. There's no need for you to buy anything. I just want you to come. I just want to come and chat with you. And so he came and we talked, and he came over to the house and we talked and we talked. And we talked for 30 minutes and 45 minutes. And he told me story after story after story. And they were so interesting and so engaging. And by the time he left, I'd bought everything that they had. And then, of course, I realized my son is just a few weeks old. And by the time he can read, which is going to be about, 4, 5, 6 years from now, by the time he can read, the encyclopedias will be totally out of date. It was really funny, and I thought, what a great storyteller this guy was. So storytellers have been revered forever, and if you can come up with a number of stories that are useful for yourself, either in business or in education and therapy, depending on how you're going to be using this, that'll be so useful to you. So let's talk about how do you actually create a metaphor. First of all, you want to pre-map, and pre-mapping means just the stuff you do first before you begin. You want to identify the sequence of behavior or events in question, which could range from a conflict between internal parts to a physical illness to a problematic relationship between client and parents or a boss or a spouse. And then number two, you want to analyze the strategy. Did you get a strategy, first of all? Is there any consistent sequence of internal representations or any representations which contribute to the current behavioral outcome? Number three is you want to identify the desired new outcomes and choices. This can be done at any level of detail. It's important that you have an outcome to work for. So you probably want to have an idea of where it is you want to go with this. And then number four, if you choose to, you can establish anchors for strategic elements involved in the current behavior. For example, on one knee, you might anchor all the strategies and representations that stop the client from having the necessary choices. And on the other knee, you might anchor any personal resources, regardless of the context the client may have or may need to have. Okay, then page 44, we're going to map the strategies in. We're going to displace the referential index, which means you're going to map over all the nouns. What does that mean, essentially? That means you're going to take all the nouns that you've discovered so far, and you're going to move them to establish characters in the story. The characters can be anything from animate to inanimate. They can be from rocks to forest creatures to cowboys to books. They can be anything you choose, and what you choose as characters is not important so long as you preserve the relationship between the characters. Very often, you may want to use characters from well-known fairy tales and myths. And then number 6, you want to establish an isomorphism, that is a relationship between the client's situation and behavior, and the situation and behaviors of the characters in the story. And now you want to map over all the verbs. So, which are all the relationships and all the interactions. So you can assign behavioral traits such as strategies and representational characteristics that parallel those in the client's present situation. That is, you pace the client's situation with the story. And then you want to make use of any anchors you established previously to secure that relationship. Then step number 7, you want to access and establish new resources in terms of characters and events in the story, which can be done in the framework of a reframing or reaccessing of a forgotten resource. And again, using any appropriate predefined, pre-established anchors. You may choose to keep the actual content of the resource ambiguous, allowing the client's unconscious processes to choose the appropriate one. You could use number 8, you could use non sequiturs, ambiguities, or direct quotes to break up sequences in the stories and direct the conscious resistance, if such resistance is present and hinders the effect of the metaphor. Conscious understanding, by the way, does not necessarily interfere with the metaphoric process. And then number 9, keep your resolution as ambiguous as possible to allow the client's unconscious processes to make appropriate changes. Collapse the pre-established anchors and provide a future pace, if possible, to check your work. Now, that is really a detailed way of how to do a metaphor. Let's jump forward for just a moment and look in the back of the notebook at our slides and chat for a moment about some ideas about how to really create a metaphor and make it really, really simple. And let's look at let's see what page we're looking at, page 45. Let's turn over to page 45. The slide is entitled Metaphor Design. So here's the thing. The very first thing you want to do when you're designing a metaphor is you want to get the present state at the bottom of the triangle on the left there, and the desired state on the right-hand side of the triangle. And when you get the present state and the desired state, you then want to ask yourself, what is the present state an example of? What is the present state an example of? And as you're asking what is an example of, you could also ask yourself, what do they like or what do they think is important? Now, you could then ask yourself, what's another example of that? And then you could create the metaphor out of that. As you bring the metaphor back down to the desired state, as the triangle goes back down the other side now, you want to make sure, you see where the words no conscious connection. You want to make sure that there's no conscious connection between the metaphor and the desired state. Now, here's an example. And this is one directly out of Erickson. Erickson one time had a client come to him, and the client's problem was that he was overeating. He was just eating too much. And Erickson told him a series of stories that were nothing, absolutely nothing about his overeating. And one of the stories sticks in my mind because it was really interesting. He talked about planting a garden, and he said, out back this year, I planted a garden. And in my garden, I planted some tomatoes. Now, it might surprise you, but tomatoes are really interesting plants, he said, because all I've been doing is I've been watering them every day. And I put some fertilizer down, and then I planted the tomato plants in the ground. And the tomato plants seem to know how to grow. They don't need much instruction from me. They know how much water to take in, and they take in exactly the right amount of water. They do take in a lot of water, and they take in nutrients from the soil. And they seem to take in the proper amount of nutrients so the tomatoes become the right size. And Erickson went on and on and on and talked about the tomato plants and how they knew exactly the right size to be. And how there wasn't a tomato plant that was really overly plump or any tomatoes that were overly too small. Because he said inside the tomato there was an intelligence. And there was a certain intelligence that would cause the tomato to be exactly the right size that it should be for that type of tomato. What a great metaphor. And he constructed the metaphor simply out of the work that he'd been doing in his garden. And it sounded like, he's talking about the garden. And the fellow who left him may even have walked away going, well, why did he sit there all the time and talk about the garden? But the fact is, when he got home, according to the write-up in the collected works of Milton H. Erickson, MD, edited by Ernest Rossi, when the guy got home, he all of a sudden started eating properly. I mean, lo and behold, he started eating correctly and he lost weight. And all it was Erickson simply talking about his tomato plants. So the metaphor. So what are we looking at? Back to our notes on page number 8 of the slides, slide number 45. The present state was he was overeating. The desired state was he didn't want to overeat. What is an example of? What is the person interested in? Well, the guy did do gardening. Erickson knew that about him. And Erickson also had his own garden. And so Erickson simply talked about his garden and the things that he grew in his garden and how those things that he grew in his garden knew how to weigh the right weight. And it was a very simple little metaphor. And the truth is no conscious connection, except, of course, the guy could have, if he'd paid attention to it, could have said, oh, yes, I understand what you're doing, Dr. Erickson. You're trying to get me to notice that my body can take in the right amount and forget the rest. And that's true. And Dr. Erickson was very, very effective with that. So let's summarize. Let's look at slide number 47 in terms of making metaphors work. Get the present state, get the desired state. You can ask yourself what prevents you, remembering what's important to the client, what's this an example of, what's of interest or value to you, what's important to you. And then the metaphor is going to bridge the gap to new resources. A very, very simple procedure, and just remembering to sort of map it over and keep some relationships consistent so that the unconscious mind picks up and utilizes it. We're going to spend more time on metaphors when you come to the training and join us. We'll actually go over it, and we'll actually see how we construct a metaphor specifically for the process of working on a presenting problem or working on something if we have a presenting problem. Let's move on now, however. Let's move on to the meta model. And the meta model, as we mentioned before, was created out of modeling Virginia Satir. And we want to look at page 45. The meta model is created out of modeling Virginia Satir. And Virginia Satir, as I mentioned, was the grand dame of family therapy. And of course, in addition to translating between rep systems, she would also get very specific with clients. And they noticed that if a client said something in a certain way, Virginia would actually chunk them down. Virginia would get real specific. And so there came, out of this, a series of questions which allow us to get more specific with the client and to assist the client in gathering lost data and lost information. Now, using the meta model has been extremely powerful in business and in education and in therapy. Before we proceed, however, I would recommend, if you have the book, The Magic of NLP Demystified, that you go ahead and read it and read chapter 3 first. If you haven't read chapter 3, then go ahead and read it now. If you don't have the book, I suggest you call the office and we'll send it to you. We certainly have them in stock, and it's probably a good idea to read it. However, if you have it, go ahead and read it now and stop the tape while you do. All right, welcome back. And now we're going to talk about the meta model. Having read the structure of Magic of NLP Demystified, you ought to ask yourself the question as you look at page 45, why is page 45 organized in the way it is? Do you ever wonder about that? Maybe you've looked at it. Have you wondered why is it organized in the way it is? What's the purpose of it being organized in that way? Interestingly enough, it's organized in the way it is, at least on this particular example, is because if we do the distortions first, if we use the distortions first, then what's going to happen is we're going to have greater leverage in assisting the problem in disappearing. So if you'll notice, if you look at the meta model on page 45, the top section, all of the questions in the response begin with how. So let's go over that and look and see what happens here. Mind reading, as we mentioned before, that's claiming to know someone's internal state without specifying the means by which you came about that. An example here is you don't like me. That's the pattern. The response would be, how do you know I don't like you? And we would predict that would recover the source of information. That is how they know. The second pattern, lost performative, those are value judgments where the person doing the valuing or the judging is left out. And the example here is it's bad to be inconsistent. Who says it's bad, according to whom, or how do you know it's bad? And the prediction here is that we'll gather evidence, recover the source of the belief or the performative or the strategy for the belief. Number 3, cause and effect, where cause is wrongly put outside the self. Example, you make me sad. The response here would be, how does what I'm doing cause you to choose to feel sad? Or you could use it in counterexample. Is there anything I've done that doesn't make you feel sad? Or have you ever done this before when you didn't feel sad? Or how specifically am I making you sad? And of course, the idea here is to recover the choice. Another good example of this is, how do you know? How do you know I make you sad? Also recovers the choice. Number 4, complex equivalence, where two experiences are interpreted as being synonymous. For example, she's always yelling at me. She doesn't like me. The response here is, how does her yelling mean that she doesn't like you? Or have you ever yelled at someone you liked? So there's a counterexample. This recovers a complex equivalence and or it gets a counterexample. And number 5, we'll use an example that has 3 presuppositions in it. If my husband knew how much I suffered, he wouldn't do that. There are 3 presuppositions in the sentence. 1, I suffer. 2, my husband acts in some way. And 3, my husband doesn't know I suffer. The questions relating to each one would be, how do you choose to suffer? How is he reacting? And how do you know he doesn't know? What this would do, the prediction of this is it would specify the choice and the verb and what he does. You'd recover the internal representation and you'd recover the complex equivalence, or you'd recover how you know. So specifically, the top part of the meta model, all of the questions have one word in common, and that's the word how. That's pretty useful. That means we can get, with literally half the meta model, we can ask the question how and come up with an answer that's pretty straightforward and we'll move it pretty quickly. Now, the second part of the meta model is generalizations. And in this section, we have universal quantifiers and modal operators. So let's see what we've got. Universal quantifiers, such as all, every, never, everyone, no one. For example, she never listens to me. You could find a counterexample. You might say never, never, or what would happen if she did listen to you. And that will recover a counterexample, or it might get effects, or it might get some outcomes, like what does she want instead. Number 7, modal operators. Modal operators of necessity, as in should, shouldn't, must not, have to, need to, it's necessary. And an example here, I have to take care of her. The response here would be, what would happen if you did? Or you could also ask, what would happen if you didn't? Or the client might say, I have to take care of her, and you could say, or, in other words, or what will happen. And that recovers the effects or the outcome, according to the prediction. And 7b, modal operators of possibility or impossibility, as in can't or can, will, won't, may not, or possible, impossible. For example, I can't tell him the truth. And you would say, so what prevents you? Or what would happen if you did? And that recovers the causes. In essence, that's going to recover the causes. So modal operators those are essentially two responses here. The first response is what would happen if you did. And the second response is what prevents you. And pretty much you can use those across the board. What would happen? The response, what would happen if I did? Or what would happen if you did? Or what would prevent you? So those kinds of things are going to recover the information. Those kinds of questions. Okay, number 8. And now we're moving into the deletions section. And we begin with a word here which is a nominalization. A nominalization is a process word which has been frozen in time, making them into nouns. For example, there's no communication here. Now, a nominalization, you see, we had pretty much across the board in generalizations the question of what would happen if or what prevents you. Now, a nominalization is a separate case. It's not going to fall under other categories. We're simply going to turn it back into a process by removing the ION at the end of the word, as in there's no communication, and turn it back into communicating. So who's not communicating what to whom? Or how would you like to be communicating, or how would you like to communicate? A nominalization actually arbitrarily takes and cuts the front end and the back end off of a process, which is communicating, and turns it into a noun, which would be called communication. What it does is it arbitrarily freezes something in time and stops the process. So the solution for a nominalization is to turn it back into a process. So for example, a client could say, well, there's no communication here. And we could say, well, how should we be communicating? Or our relationship isn't working. And the response is, how should we be relating? Another example, I regret my decision. The response is, what was it that you were deciding? So a nominalization, you simply turn it back into a process. And what that does is it gives the client a lot of choices. By the way, as an aside here, a nominalization is something that's really interesting because in the case of a dis-ease, and I mispronounced the word on purpose, medicine needs to nominalize a dis-ease in order to be able to talk about it. Now, the problem with nominalizing a dis-ease is you often tend to put the client into a box and you give the dis-ease a greater reality than it might otherwise have. So here's an example. A client comes to you and says, I have hypertension. And if you go to the medical doctor and the medical doctor says you have hypertension, what do? You get all tense. So if a client comes to you and says, I have hypertension, one question might be, how do you hypertense yourself? And is there ever a time when you forget? Now, most people who have a disease actually create their disease somehow. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to timeline therapy. The client who has a specific medical condition, which has been diagnosed and which has a specific name, unfortunately, that diagnosis puts the client into a box. And Stephen Gilligan, as I mentioned before, said something really interesting. He said, I don't diagnose my clients anymore. He said, I just check the other box. And he said, I don't diagnose them because if I diagnose them, that's going to put them into a box in my mind. And I don't want to do that. So he turns, in his own mind, he's turned the entire process of therapy into a situation where he didn't diagnose what the client was. He said in his mind, this client's fine as they are. And when a client brings him a presenting problem, he says, oh, I see you're up to creating some big change in your life. And the size of the problem that the client brings him, he believes, is related to the size of the change the client's going to end up with. Fabulous thinking, just fabulous thinking. Okay, on to number 9. Unspecified verbs, he rejected me. Of course, there's no specificity on the verb as to how did he reject you, so you could ask how specifically. And that specifies the verb. Simple deletions, such as I am uncomfortable, you could say about what or whom, that recovers the deletion. Lack of referential index fails to specify a person or a thing. For example, they don't listen to me. You could say, well, who specifically doesn't listen to you? And about what? And number C, comparative deletions, as in good, better, best, worst, more, less, most, least. She's a better person. Better than whom? Better at what? Compared to whom? or compared to what. And then one other note here, which isn't necessarily covered in the meta model, but is a comparative deletion, one other example, and that is the words clearly and obviously are also comparative deletions. And of course, the question would be clearly according to whom, or clearly or obviously compared to what. So the example would be the same. So that's the meta model, and use the meta model. The meta model is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful example of getting more specific. I've got a wonderful story for you, which comes from Dave Shepard. Dave is one of our master trainers that we've trained, and he's in London. And Dave said he had a client, and he was talking to this client about enrolling and becoming him doing trainings for them. And the fellow said, Dave, he said, how much do you charge for doing trainings? And Dave said, well, sir, I charge £2,000 per day. And the fellow said at the other end of the phone, said, that's a lot of money. And Dave said, compared to what? And the fellow stopped. And there was silence, on the other end of the phone. And he was very silent for Dave said a minute or two. It seemed like it was forever. And then the guy said, piano lessons. And Dave said, right. And then they both laughed, and he bought. So the meta model is going to recover our deeper structure. Let's look at page 8 of the slides, and notice here where it says surface structure. Now what happens is that the surface structure is usually backed up by your deeper structure, which is unconscious. The surface structure is what we usually get as an utterance, but usually beneath the surface structure, there's a deep structure. And the deep structure, if you look over on the right now, is supported by a specific thought, which gets generalized to thoughts, and then distorted to the next box above the word thoughts, which is theogosts, and then gets deleted and becomes ugh. So oftentimes the surface structure has no relationship to the deeper structure. It has no relationship to the deeper structure, which, in fact, the client is uttering or using as an example, but is not anywhere related to the deeper structure. And so the meta model simply allows us to get back at and to recover that deeper structure information. The meta model is extremely valuable and a lot of fun to work with, and I would suggest that here's what I did. What I did was I took it out of my notebook again, and I put it in my pocket. And to be honest with you, I think I must have carried, since the meta model was only one page, I must have carried that around for 2 years. And I would take it out and I'd read it over and over and over again. You can Xerox it, you can make a copy of it, carry it around in your pocket, and just look at the examples and look at the responses. This will repay you in great rewards by your being able to control the level of language. As you learn that you can control the level of language, what will happen is you'll become more and more capable of moving language in a certain direction. You'll find that you're more and more capable of moving language or moving the conversation in a direction that works for you. You'll find that you're more and more capable of moving language in a direction and having a structure of being able to create the kinds of words that you want to create in the kind of order that you want to produce the results that you want. Remember that great communicators throughout all time have been totally masterful creators, communicators, and totally capable of making those shifts at the unconscious level with clients as they did. Now, Erickson's 30 pages, he found that eventually he could cut them down to 1 page. But as you begin, I hope that you can create and add and begin to add on to those 30 pages and move them so that you actually have a number of pages. And eventually, as you learn them, you can forget them. Because as you forget them, they'll come into the unconscious level and they'll be stored in the unconscious mind. And what will happen one day if you practice your language faithfully and regularly is you'll open your mouth one day and you'll go, well, blah, blah, blah. And you'll say something and out of your mouth will come something and you go, whoa, that sounds just like someone I know. And then the response will be, that's right. Thanks for joining us for our tour de force of language. This is program number 8, and it concludes our 2-segment program on language. We're going to move into anchoring next in program number 9.